Part 2 to Part 4 of the RA 9271. Section 7. Vessels to be inspected. All vessels coming from foreign ports are subject to quarantine inspection upon entry in any port of the Philippines. Vessels cleared in one port in the Philippines are deemed cleared for all other ports in the country, except in cases of any vessel with an infectious disease, subject to the regulations, emerging disease, public health, emergency of international concern, and or death on board. Section 8. Requirements for vessels to be inspected. Any vessel coming from foreign ports subject to quarantine inspection shall be considered in quarantine until given a pratique. Such vessel shall fly a yellow flag at its foremast upon entry into the harbor. Drop its anchor at the quarantine anchorage. Put down its accommodation ladder and wait for the quarantine medical officer. During inclement weather conditions, a proper shelter or lee should be afforded to the quarantine boarding officer before the boarding formality can be conducted. In cases of extreme weather condition, the boarding formality could be held in abeyance until such conditions would be favorable. Section 9. Requirements from the master of vessels to be inspected. 9.1. The master of the vessel shall provide the quarantine medical officer the following duly accomplished documents. 9.2. The master of any vessel on which a case or suspected case of an infectious disease subject to the regulations, emerging disease exists and or a public health emergency of international concern exists board shall, as soon as practicable, notify the Bureau of Quarantine at the next port of call or station, and shall take such measures to prevent the spread of the disease as the Bureau directs. 9.3. The ship captain may be ordered to muster the crew and passengers on board in a well-lighted and ventilated place for inspection when deemed necessary. The deck officer in the charge of health and or the ship surgeon physician shall provide the quarantine medical officer the medical data of crew or passengers. He shall assist the quarantine medical officer to the sick bay cabin to examine any patient and review his clinical records for evaluation and management. Section 10. Kinds of pratique or clearance issued to incoming vessels. 10.1. Free pratique. A pratique issued to a vessel which has complied with the quarantine rules and regulations as provided in this IRR. 10.2. Provisional pratique. A pratique issued to vessels which have the following conditions. 10.3. Controlled free pratique or direct berthing privilege. A pratique granted to vessels with a request for a direct berthing privilege submitted within 48 hours prior to the estimated time of arrival, or ETA, duly signed or certified by the master of the vessel with the following conditions. 10.4. Radio pratique. A pratique granted to military vessels of the Republic of the Philippines and foreign countries under the following conditions. 10.5. Controlled radio pratique. A pratique granted to cruise vessels under the following conditions. Condition number 1. There should be a ship surgeon or physician on board. Condition number 2. The request for controlled radio pratique shall be submitted to the Bureau within 48 hours before the estimated time of arrival. Condition number 3. The ports visited during the voyage should be stated in the request that no infectious disease subject to the regulations, emerging disease and or public health emergency of international concern is present or endemic at the ports of origin. Condition number 4. There should be no actual or suspected case on board of an infectious disease subject to the regulations, emerging disease or public health emergency of international concern. Last condition. The quarantine medical personnel shall board the vessel at the anchorage and conduct quarantine inspection while the vessel is slowly proceeding towards the port. Section 11. Immunization certificate requirement. 11.1 Yellow fever. Travelers arriving from the yellow fever infected areas are required to present valid international certificates of vaccination against yellow fever if arriving within 6 days from that area. The validity of this certificate shall extend for a period of 10 years, beginning 10 days after the date of immunization or reimmunization. The yellow fever vaccination centers in the country accredited by the WHO are Quarantine Central Office, Manila, Cebu Quarantine Station, and Davao Quarantine Station. 11.2 The Director of Quarantine may from time to time prescribe or require immunization from certain diseases if in his discretion such requirements are essential, on account of varying public health conditions. 11.3 Other vaccinations may be administered upon request. Section 12 Extent and Method of Quarantine Inspection. 12.1 During the inspection of vessels, the quarantine medical officer shall check the following conditions before granting a pratique to the vessel. Section 13 Boarding of vessel from foreign ports placed under quarantine. 13.1 In case of a notification of the presence of suspected cases of infectious disease subject to the regulations, emerging disease and or public health emergency of international concern and or death on board. 13.2 In cases when the vessel is exposed to radiological, biological, or chemical terrorism, the tailored actions in such incidents should be followed in accordance to the interim guidelines on preparedness and response to radiological, biological, and chemical or RBC incidents. 14. Requirements of vessels before departure. No vessels shall be allowed to depart from any seaport of the Philippines to foreign destination without securing an outgoing quarantine clearance from the Director of Quarantine or his duly authorized representative. This clearance shall be granted to the vessel on condition that such a vessel has observed all quarantine requirements imposed. This clearance shall be a requirement for the granting of a customs clearance for departure. Section 15. Embarkation of travelers for international voyage. The Director of Quarantine, when he considers it necessary, may order the medical examination of travelers and may disallow of any suspected person having an infectious disease subject to the regulations, emerging disease, and or public health emergency of international concern from embarking on an international voyage except in case of the transport of sick person by a conveyance especially provided for the purpose in order to safeguard the health of the passenger and crew. Section 16. Personnel assigned for inspection. The quarantine inspection of vessels shall be conducted by the quarantine medical officer and or a duly accredited assistant designated by the Director of Quarantine. In seaport where there is no quarantine medical officer, a duly trained physician will be designated by the Undersecretary of Health as acting or alternate quarantine medical officer upon the recommendation of the Director of Quarantine, who shall perform such function of an annual contractual basis. Section 17. Time of vessel quarantine inspection. Inspection of vessels required by these regulations shall be made between 0800 to 1200 H and 1300 to 1700 H, Mondays to Fridays. Any inspection performed outside of these hours and during Saturdays, Sundays, and holidays shall be compensated for. Hence, reasonable reimbursement by the concerned shipping company may be allowed by the Director of Quarantine in relation to the incurred expenses and services rendered by each quarantine personnel. Section 18. Vessels to be inspected. All domestic vessels plying domestic ports with the presence of infectious disease subject to the regulations, emerging disease, public health emergency of international concern, and or death on board are subject to quarantine inspection and clearance. In ports where there are no quarantine officials, clearance of these vessels will be coordinated with the local health authorities. Section 19. Requirements for vessels to be inspected. Domestic vessels subject to inspection shall be considered in quarantine until properly cleared. Such vessel shall fly a yellow flag at its foremast upon entry into the harbor, drop its anchor at the quarantine anchorage, put down its accommodation ladder, and wait for the quarantine medical officer. During inclement weather conditions, a proper shelter or lee should be afforded to the quarantine boarding officer before the boarding formality can be conducted. In cases of extreme weather condition, the boarding formality could be held in abeyance until such condition would be favorable. Section 20. Requirements from the master of vessels to be inspected. 20.1. The master of the vessel shall provide the quarantine medical officer the following duly accomplished documents. 20.2. The master of inter-island or domestic vessel on which a case or suspected case of an infectious disease subject to the regulations, emerging disease, and or public health emergency of international concern exists on board shall, as soon as practicable, notify the Bureau of Quarantine at the next port of call or station, and shall take such measures to prevent the spread of the disease as the Bureau directs. 20.3. The ship captain may be ordered to muster the crew and passengers on board in a well-lighted and ventilated place for inspection when deemed necessary. The deck officer in charge of health or the ship's surgeon-physician shall provide the quarantine medical officer the medical data of crew or passengers. Section 21. Immunization requirements. The Director of Quarantine may from time to time prescribe or require immunization from certain diseases if in his discretion such requirements are essential on account of varying public health conditions. Section 22. Extent and method of quarantine inspection. During the inspection of vessels, the quarantine medical officer shall check the following conditions. 22.1. State of health of the passengers and crew. 22.2. Existence or non-existence of an infectious disease subject to the regulations, emerging disease, and or public health emergency of international concern outbreak of international concern from the port of origin or the other previous ports of call. 22.3. Sanitary conditions on board. 22.4. Validity of the derating exemption certificate and state of rat life on board. And lastly, 22.5. Type of tonnage of cargo. Section 23. Personnel assigned for inspection of inter-island vessel. The quarantine inspection of vessels shall be conducted by the quarantine medical officer and a duly accredited assistants designated by the Director of Quarantine. In port where there is no quarantine medical officer, a duly trained physician will be designated by the Undersecretary of Health as acting or alternate quarantine medical officer upon the recommendation of the Director of Quarantine, who shall perform such function on an annual contractual basis. Section 24. Boarding of domestic vessel placed under quarantine. 24.1. In case of notification of the presence of suspected case or cases of infectious disease subject to the regulations, emerging disease, and or public health emergency of international concern and or death on board. 24.2. In cases when the vessel is exposed to radiological, biological, or chemical terrorism, the tailored actions in such incident should be followed in accordance to the interim guidelines on preparedness and response to radiological, biological, and chemical incidents. Section 25. Requirements of vessel while in port. 25.1. Rat guards on mooring connection lines. If the vessel docks alongside with the piers, all mooring lines shall be provided with prescribed rat guards not less than 1 meter in diameter and so fixed as to be always at right angle to the line to which it is attached. 25.2 Cargo net, gangway plank, and ramp. All cargo nets should be hauled up when not in use. The gangway, plank, and/or ramp shall be lifted up when it's not operating and well lighted throughout the night to prevent the access of rodents. Section 26. Disposal of garbage. No vessel shall be allowed to dump garbage or wastes overboard while in the harbor. Garbage should be collected in prescribed containers for disposal. When a vessel is in port, arrangements should be made for the regular removal of garbage by a disposal service in accordance with environmental and health provisions on waste disposal to ensure that it is properly collected, treated, and disposed of in accordance with existing standards and law. Section 27. Rat inspection of vessels. 27.1. The following vessels shall be subject to rat inspection while in the harbor. 27.2. Any inspection for rat infestation shall be under supervision of the quarantine medical officer, and all findings shall be recorded in the deratting inspection form. Deratting measures shall be conducted depending on the degree of rat infestation, and a corresponding certificate will be issued. 27.3. Kinds of deratting certificate. Number 1. Deratting certificate. A certificate being issued after a deratting measure has been performed, such as fumigation or rat poisoning and trapping, which is valid for 6 months from the date of issuance. 27.3.2 are the second kind of deratting certificate. Deratting exemption certificate. A certificate being issued when there is no evidence of rat infestation on board and is valid for 6 months from the date of issuance. Number 3. Extension of certificate. A certificate being issued which shall be valid for 1 month from the date of issuance, with instruction that formal inspection and issuance of a deratting exemption certificate shall be done in the next port authorized to conduct such inspection and issuance of certificate. This certificate can only be issued once. Section 28. Fumigation. The followings are subject to fumigation while in the harbor. Number 1. Any vessel with human or rodent plague on board. Number 2. Any vessel moderately or heavily infested with rats or other pests and vermins. Number 3. Cargoes in a vessel from a plague-infected port which are vulnerable to harbor rats and fleas. However, if the cargo is covered by a valid certificate of fumigation from the port of loading, the fumigation may be waived subject to the verification of the authenticity of the certification. Number 4. Inter-island vessels for their periodic annual fumigation.